Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Well, we can go ahead and get started. I just wanted to say thanks for coming to everybody, and I appreciate you guys supporting your fellow students and taking an interest in history as well. A little bit of a passionate individual about the past. So I'll let him talk to you about what he has prepared today. He's worked really hard.
Well, thank you guys for coming to my presentation. My name is Hunter Tyler. I'm a senior here in the history program. And for my capstone project, I focused on the decolonization of the British Empire. The question I looked at was, how did the British colonization policy change because of the effects of the First World War? To better focus on this, I looked at 3 case examples of Ireland, India, and Palestine. Back in August of 2015, Professor Getz and I began brainstorming and working on ideas as to what I should really focus on my project on. I told him I had a great passion for World War I and that I really liked the time period in which older ideas of the 18th and 19th century began to collide with the 20th century technology and ideas, and just kind of the events that happened during that small time frame. For this, I decided to focus on British colonization, and to give a better idea of what the situation was for the British colonization post-World War, I focused on 3 different colonies for a contrasting view as to how their policies and needs changed with the realities of the situation. This is a map of Britain pre-World War I. As you can see, they had holdings all over the world. For Britain in the colonial system, they had colonies, but they also had dominions, which were Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. These dominions supported Britain. This is a graphic here, as you can see, where different dominions are represented by smaller dogs, and Britain is the bigger overall dog. British Imperial Size pre-World War I, they had major holdings on every continent. They were a major world power. Pre-war, they were a creditor nation, which meant that they loaned money out to smaller nations. Just to show the strain, or just to show the size of their wealth power, the financial capital at the time was London, which meant that all major business and bank transactions were generally headquartered or went through the capital. For Britain, the colonial system did not put a strain on national resources. This meant that for Britain, she could operate both her military and her economic base without the colonies putting too much of a pull on manpower, wealth, anything else that they might need to hold them. For this also, Britain relied on dominions, the 4 countries I talked about before. The difference between dominions and colonies is that dominions were self-governed, they were all once colonies, and when they became independent, or when Britain granted them home rule status, they still had to owe a vow of loyalty to the crown. On the opposite side of the coin, though, for colonies under the British policy, they were governed by Britain completely, internally and externally. Their economy was built around supporting British interests and needs in that area, and whatever resources they saw that area could greatly generate. And they were completely controlled by British military forces stationed throughout wherever their country was. The first case example I looked at was Ireland. This is a map of Lower Ireland and the 6 counties in the north, which are still under British control to this day. Ireland was one of the British's oldest colonies, dating back to the 15th century. They were not given dominion status. It meant they were kept in direct colonial control. This meant that Britain did have troops stationed there. They put down reprisals of any kind, and they completely governed Ireland externally and internally. This was because Britain was reluctant to give Ireland their freedom. They deemed the country too unstable for freedom and didn't want the idea of an unstable country being right next to their own mainland. Right before the war, though, they did promise the Irish people home rule. The British House of Lower Parliament began the process of putting forth a home rule bill for Ireland, but the outbreak of the war put that bill on hold indefinitely. During the war, there was still a small minority of Irish extremists who fought for home rule status. These extremists were determined, regardless of what the situation was outside of Ireland, to gain freedom for the country. One of the biggest examples of this fighting happened in the Easter Rising, which was a large-scale revolt in Dublin on Easter Day in 1916. The majority of the Irish, though, supported the Crown's efforts in the war under the belief that home rule would be granted post-war and when peace resumed. Following the conclusion of the war, though, home rule was not granted, and Britain increased militancy throughout the country from 1918 to 1921. This caused large unrest in the country. Many of the original supporters in Ireland of the Crown quickly turned, and the time period between 1918 and 1921 is often referred to as the Irish War for Independence. It was during this time that Brits sent over a special unit of troops known as the Black and Tans. These troops were specially recruited soldiers from various parts of the British military, specifically designed to put down Irish revolutionaries and suppress any revolutionary ideals. The name Black and Tans comes from the British's own resourcing problem in the war. They could not outfit these standard troops with normal military uniforms, so rather than that, they were given black shirts and tan khakis, and then they got the name Black and Tans. But after 3 years of heavy guerrilla warfare and thousands of British troop deaths, the island proved to be too much of a strain on British military forces, and the British Parliament finally granted home rule status, Dominion status, in 1921. This gave Ireland the same rights as the other 4 dominions, in which they could internally and externally govern themselves, but they still did owe an oath of loyalty to the Crown. This is some visuals of the time for Ireland. On the left here, you can see a poster depicting the Easter Rising. It kind of idealizes the rebels and their struggle. This is a propaganda poster in Ireland to join Sinn Féin, one of the leading political parties at the time. The next case I looked at was India. India was one of the largest colonies Britain had. As you can see, the sphere of influence that they controlled in India actually now borders many, many different countries. India was considered the crown jewel of the British Empire. They were like I said, the biggest colony and one of the most important to Britain. During the war, they contributed the most of any other colony in terms of manpower, supplies, even financial, monetary loans. They sent 1.5 million troops, 2.5 million tons of supplies, and even went as far as to loan Britain $25 million during the war. The Indian national leaders were under the same pretense of loyalty that if they were dedicated to the war effort, if they gave it all during the war, that Britain would grant home rule status or independence. This was the same ideals that Irish leaders had during the war also, that their loyalty at this time of need would later benefit them in the long run. Unfortunately, the British Office of Colonial Affairs deemed India too vital to the rebuilding efforts of a post-war economy and increased military presence within the country. They saw that the efforts that India had put in during the war would become, they thought that the efforts that India put in during the war would further increase their ability to recover from the war afterwards. Another thought that Britain had in India was the ideal of the white man's burden. This is a colonial idea of the time that Britain was not there to conquer India, but rather to civilize the country. One of the examples that we can still see of this today comes to us in the story of the Jungle Book. This was a series of stories originally written by Rudyard Kipling, a known British imperialist and also the author of The White Man's Burden. These stories portrayed India as a young, childish country just emerging from the jungle, not fully ready to join the world community and be their own full independent country. Also, unlike Ireland at the time, Indian nationalist leaders led a campaign of nonviolent protests. For the standpoint of Britain, these nonviolent protests were much easier to control and would ultimately not cost Britain, manpower, resources to fight off the Indian rebels, but rather they would just sit back and let them do these nonviolent protests. These Indian nationalists were led by Mahatma Gandhi, also a known nonviolent supporter. Here's some visuals for India. The one on the far left is a war loan poster talking about how Indians need to do their part for the war and donate money to help the cause. This is Mahatma Gandhi. He was the Indian nationalist leader for independence, and he was a strong advocate for nonviolent protests. On the far right here, we have Indian troops known as sepoys. Another aspect of the white man's burden in which Britain saw Indian contributions is that they did not allow Indian troops to fight in the main white European theater. Rather, they posted them to outer colony duties or rebuilding duties, and most of the time it was just day-to-day menial work for the Indian troops rather than actual contributions and fighting. The last case I looked at was Palestine. Palestine sits between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. It borders Egypt, now Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Unlike the previous two colonies, though, Palestine was not under British control until after the war. During World War I, Britain realized just how exposed and vulnerable the Suez Canal was for them. It was at this time that Britain had intercepted a transmission between Germany and the Ottoman Empire describing a group of German officials or officers being sent down to the Ottoman Empire to lead a Turkish army on a direct assault of the Suez Canal. Without the Suez Canal, Britain would be cut off from India and their war efforts would be severely crippled in this manner. It was at this point that Britain realized they needed a land buffer between the Suez Canal and any aggressions from the east, where they might lose the canal in some future conflict. Britain was one of the main authors of the Treaty of Versailles, and they were able to put into the treaty wording that they would gain Palestine under a mandate control to help them better protect the Suez Canal. After they got control of the mandate, though, they gave away most of the land to other Arab leaders. The chunk of land they gave out in the east is now what we call Jordan. They really wanted to focus on that map I showed you in the first part, just that key vital section there between the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, that just blocked any aggression towards Egypt. For the British, it was two groups vying for power in the area, European Jewish settlers and Arab natives. This made it much easier for the British to control the land as they could play off both groups and let them fight each other rather than Britain have to focus on fighting just one group for control. This also made it easier for Britain to control the area, as that most of the Arab leaders at the time were not as worried with freeing Palestine, as they had just gained 3 new countries in the course of 10 years between Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. Britain encouraged European Jewish migration due to their better understanding of dealings with Europeans rather than Arabs. For the British, it would be easier for them to deal with other Europeans in an area they weren't familiar with, rather than have to learn a whole new set of traditions, languages, and peoples to deal with at the time. This playing off the 2 groups, though, would later come to backfire on the British when tensions became too great in 1948, and the British were forced to withdraw. This led to the creation of the State of Israel, and we can still see to this day the problems that those actions had of playing off 2 groups have now in Palestine, where it's still an unstable country and it's still an unstable region. This is some visuals for Palestine. As you can see, there is the key vital route from Britain to India and how the supplies would come to Europe. The Suez Canal is located right here, and any aggression from countries in this area down would be buffered or stopped by Palestine's placement right there. It was the linchpin of the route to India for Britain, which was their most vital supply route during both the war and the post-war needs. During the war, British losses meant that they needed to change their thinking about colonies in order to preserve the empire. Some colonies and dominions were better relinquished to secure interests they deemed to have higher priorities. An example of this, as I said, was Ireland was released, but at the same time, India was better reinforced to show a contrast in view in how Britain saw the priorities in colonial policy change. They realized that India had become way more important to them than wasting troops and manpower in Ireland, a country not economically as supporting or as wealthy as India. For them to better control India, they needed some place to protect their most vital highway, which is the Suez Canal. This is how the acquisition of Palestine came to be, due to the direct effects of this reprioritizing of India. But Britain did not wish to relinquish her influence. Many British citizens saw themselves as civilizers of the world. Like I discussed, they saw themselves as the bringers of civilization. They saw themselves, their mission in India, as bringing India forth into the new world, not as being their conquerors and exploiting their country, but rather than as a role model for the Indian citizens of what to become. One of the most famous Winston Churchill quotes comes from, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." No one within the empire wanted to downsize or lose any of the empire. British citizens were also very proud of their empire at the time. But the realities of the post-war needs and the post-war economic needs were just too great for Britain to ignore. It was either they fight to preserve the empire just a little bit longer, or they make subtle cutbacks and changes in which to preserve it further. It wasn't until the aftermath of World War II the British Empire was reduced to just a fraction of the size it used to be. The toll of 2 world wars and a global economic recession in the 30s was just too much of a strain for the British Empire to withstand and prop up her empire any longer. This is a visual of the empire pre-World War I, and this is a visual of the empire present day. As you can see, they still got the Falklands though. They're good. Thank you guys for coming to my capstone presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions? All right.
Go on.
Thank you.
I had one question. I just, and this is just a little detail that maybe raises another question, a larger question. But I know Kipling lost a son in the First World War. So many people did. And I was just curious if you knew anything about how that would have changed his view of colonialism. Since he had written, the poem, The White Man's Burden.
Yeah.
The linchpin for that. Something to explore possibly.
I mean, from my understanding of it, that it probably would have made him even more, prioritize having India, as he was born and he grew up in India. And he saw later when he went back to Europe that, like you said, Britain desperately needed India still as a colony. His son had died fighting the war, so he probably saw the need to keep this colony just a little bit longer after the war to help Britain recover.
Yeah. Maybe the son didn't die in vain.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a film that's been done on the story. Interesting. It's one take on it. Just the grief is overwhelming because he was not only was